Okay, hi guys, welcome back to the next chapter of Roald Dahl, the BFG. This one's called Capture. It's really long, but if I get time, I may read the next one. It's quite short, but I'm just going to see how this goes, and then if not, I owe you another read along video. I believe we're on the last two chapters, which is crazy. But here we go. I'm just reading this for pleasure and entertainment. This is all Roald Dahl's own work, of course. Off we go. This chapter is called Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head, he had never before travelled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to, but this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gawped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then the pilots of helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them and they always waved back. The pilots marvelled at the giant's speed and the way he leaped across wide rivers and over huge houses, but they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We is going fast as a fizzle crump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward, as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realised they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles just full speed. Even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache. He was very proud of his moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was super adventure. "It's fun going to new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page. I expect that old giant knows where he's going," said the young pilot. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him, sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. "As in all atlas there were completely 2 blank pages at the very end. So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this god-forsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead, and all the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers, and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giants is all out of sight here," the BFG told them. "But if you is taking these slosh-bunking and noisy heli-boppers any closer, the giants is waking up at once, and then goes the weasel." So you want us to proceed by jeep, the head of the army said. Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeep followed close behind. Suddenly the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns!" he cried. "There is a raging battle somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here." "Pigs, Piffle," the BFG said. "Those noises are not guns." "Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the army. "I'm a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back! Those is just a giant snorting in their sleep," the BFG said. "I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snore when I is near one." "Aren't you are you quite sure?" the army man said anxiously. "Positive," the BFG said. "Proceed cautiously," the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at the distance they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand, the jeeps all stopped, the soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If one of them was waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say Jack Napchoy," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one what won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eaten giants. Me and Sophie is safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the army took several paces to the rear, so did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back to their jeep, ready to make fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, then," the head of the army said. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie, now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood near watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes 8 of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The knight, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lamp eater opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rotten man-hugger?" Suddenly he saw the soldiers. In a flash he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar he leaped to his feet. The soldiers were petrified with fear, froze where they were, but they had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings!" the flesh on Peter yelled. "What is all you flesh-bunking, rotten, half-baked beings doing in our country?" He made a grab at the soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something!" she cried. "Quick, before he eats him!" "Put that human being down!" the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with these grotty twigglers?" he bellowed. "You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush in the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly she undid it. "I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. Then she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs. She rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You is bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. I was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was as deadly as dangerous thin screamed viper." "Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets! I was bitten by a septitious venomous thin screamed viper." He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the dreadly viper is still sticking into me," he yelled. "I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth at once," he cried. "Otherwise you is deader than a duck soup. I is helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and brittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the vennomous viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signalled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him, with both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankles. It was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a knot. "I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said, as he pulled the knot. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I is pizened to death." "There he is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and wriggled, he fought and he friggled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done you," Sophie cried. "Well done you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the Queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. "When you is only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you is sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The head of the army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" "Now you is driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," said the BFG. "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army General said. "It is the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So 9 jeeps drove across the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of the small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now, we is driving back to the belly boppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully jar by jar on the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. The finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. "I is flush bunkled," roared the flesh lump eater. "I is wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I is swog swallowed," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I is goose grubbled," howled the man hugger. I is Gunsel White, shouted the meat trooper. I is Flunk Cuggles, screamed the maid smasher. I is Slop Grogbles, squawked the disgurgler. I is Croc Squinkled, yelled the blood bottler. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front of the rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and one hook near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Okay, I'm definitely going to have time to read the next one. It's only like 2 and a bit pages, so I'm going to keep going. And this will be the last chapter. So, this one's called Feeding Time. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilised to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and the engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all the 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this, because the moment the giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. I has told you before, he said. Giants is never eating giants, so I is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Rat Jobbinson. With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in a fury. Why is they putting us down here in this grub-sludging hole? They shouted at the BFG. Because you is guzzling human beings, the BFG answered. I is always warning you not to do it, and you is never taking the titchest bit of notice. In that case, the flesh-lump Peter bellowed, I think we is guzzling you instead. The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from giant country lay at the top of the pit. What's in there? The Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man. Snozzcumbers, he cried. This is the repulsant Snozzcumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgusted giants from now on. May I taste it? The Queen asked. Don't, Magister, don't, cried the BFG. This is tasting of trog filth and pig squibble. With that, he tossed Snozzcumber down the giants below. There's your supper, he shouted. Have munch on that. He fished out more Snozzcumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. It serves them right, left, and centre, he said. What will we feed them on when the Snozzcumbers are all used up? The Queen asked him. They is never being used up, Magister, the BFG answered, smiling. I is also bringing in this sack a whole bundle of Snozzcumber plants, which I is giving with your permission to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of this repulsive food to feed those thirsty giants on. "What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. "You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool, I can see that." And that is the end. The last bit of this book was about the author and how he came to write the book, but I'm not going to read that bit. And end of an era again. I just want to say thank you so much, guys, for all your support and reading. And while I'm reading this, just giving it a listen. I've had a couple of likes and quite a few views. So honestly, thank you. So another childhood book of mine reread and um, all on YouTube for you guys to hear. Thank you again for your support as always. I really enjoy doing these read along videos. So let me know what you want to hear down below in the comments next. I don't know what I've got, but please just let me know down below what would you like to request for me to read next. Thank you again for all your support, and until the next time, guys. Bye.